He left home chasing fortune. But when he came back, wealth couldn't hide the truth waiting at his doorstep. His own son hungry, crying, begging a neighbor for food. In that single moment, the man who thought he had everything realized he'd lost what truly mattered. May this story remind you to hold your loved ones close and never let success make you forget the meaning of family. Where are you listening from, my friend, and what time is it there right now? Nate Callahan's life looked perfect from the outside, but inside his luxury penthouse, silence was his only companion. The October air over Boston had that sharp, clean edge that came just before winter. From the wide glass windows on the 30th floor, the whole city stretched beneath him, alive with lights. Cars crawled along the Charles River Bridge like tiny sparks. To anyone else, the view was priceless. To Nate, it was just another reminder of how far he'd climbed and how lonely it felt at the top. He set his phone down on the marble counter, the screen still glowing with financial charts. A steak, perfectly cooked earlier by the building's catering service, rested on his plate, barely touched. He pressed his hand to the cool stone surface, feeling the emptiness of the apartment echo in his chest. Cassie's voice suddenly filled the room bright, glittering, and distant. She was calling from a gala in Newport, Rhode Island. He could hear music swelling behind her, the clink of champagne glasses, the hum of society chatter. "Smile more when you speak on camera, Nate," she said quickly. "They love when you look approachable. I'll send you the clip." Nate forced a chuckle. Approachable. Right, thanks, Cass. But she had already turned her attention to someone else in the crowd. He listened to her laughter too high, too polished, and ended the call. The silence that followed was heavier than before. He walked to the living room, where modern art hung on the walls and leather chairs gleamed under recessed lighting. Yet among the trophies of his success, one frame stood out. It was small, tucked to the side of a shelf, as if it didn't belong in this sleek world. It held a picture of him in college, standing on the steps of Harvard Yard, his arm around a woman with warm eyes and a shy smile. Rebecca. His throat tightened. He poured himself a glass of bourbon, the ice cracking as he swirled it. Those were different days before the endless flights, the boardroom battles, the cold negotiations that made him who he was now. Back then, he had thought love was enough. But careers don't wait for love. And he had chosen ambition. He sat on the edge of his leather sofa, staring at the amber liquid. The city lights reflected across the glass walls, shimmering like a million stars out of reach. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "What have you built this all for?" Nate rubbed his temples. He was only 45, yet the weight of his choices pressed down like years unspoken. He remembered dinners eaten alone, anniversaries spent in airports, and birthdays celebrated with a polite text. The bourbon burned down his throat, but it didn't warm him. He walked back to the window and stood there, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight. Boston was alive, but his penthouse felt like a mausoleum. The elevator shaft below hummed faintly, distant as the laughter of strangers. For a long time, he didn't move. He simply stood in the glow of the city that admired him, but did not know him. He whispered to himself, almost without realizing, "All this, and still something's missing." The sound of his own voice startled him. He wasn't a man who confessed weakness, even to himself. His empire had been built on control of numbers, markets, and people. Yet control couldn't silence the hollowness of a penthouse that felt more like a showroom than a home. He set the glass down on the counter with a soft clink and loosened his tie. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed, echoing through the cold night. It reminded him of Sunday mornings as a boy in Maine, when his father would pile everyone into the station wagon and drive to the white-steepled church at the center of town. He hadn't been back in years. The memory brought a tug of longing he quickly pushed aside. Nate walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator gleamed, stocked with expensive cheeses, imported wines, trays of catered meals sealed in plastic. But nothing inside reminded him of family, of warmth. No casserole wrapped in foil, no jug of milk with fingerprints on the handle, no pie cooling on the counter. Just curated abundance meant to impress, not to comfort. He opened one of the meals, then shut it again without touching it. Instead, he drifted to the balcony. The air was sharp with October chill. From up here, Boston's streets stretched like veins of light, pulsing with the lives of millions. Laughter rose faintly from the sidewalk 30 floors below, young people spilling out of a diner, their arms linked, scarves flapping in the wind. They tipped the waitress generously as they left. He could hear her cheerful, "Thank you, folks," drift into the night. The sound was distant, yet it pierced him. He wondered when he had last laughed like that, carefree, surrounded by people who knew him not for what he owned, but for who he was. He couldn't remember. The city continued its rhythm, taxis honking, a ferry's horn carrying over the harbor. Nate stayed rooted, hands braced on the balcony rail. He thought again of Rebecca, her easy smile, the way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. He wondered where she was now. Did she ever think of him? Or had she long ago moved on, built a family that didn't include him? A cold gust whipped across the balcony, breaking his thoughts. He turned back inside, shutting the glass door. His penthouse was silent again, only the faint hum of the HVAC filling the space. He walked past the framed photo on the shelf, his gaze lingering just long enough to stir an ache that bourbon couldn't drown. The digital clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Cassie hadn't called back. She rarely did when she was at events. Her world was all flashing bulbs and perfect smiles, a stage he had grown weary of. Nate rubbed his jaw and sank into the leather chair by the window. The city lights flickered against the glass, as if mocking him with their constancy. He leaned his head back, staring into the ceiling shadows. The silence pressed in again, thick and unrelenting. And then, almost against his will, the thought escaped his lips, a thought he hadn't dared to shape before tonight. All this, and still something's missing. The words hung in the empty room, fragile yet undeniable, as though the walls themselves were waiting for an answer he didn't have. The next evening, in the quiet town of Salem, the air carried the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. While Boston roared with traffic and city lights, Salem moved at a slower rhythm. Porches glowed with soft lanterns, and the faint laughter of children playing tag drifted down Maple Street. Margaret O'Donnell sat by her fireplace, knitting a scarf for her granddaughter, when a soft knock came at the door. She glanced at the clock past 9. Few people came calling at this hour. Rising slowly, she made her way to the front porch and opened the door. There stood Elliot Monroe, the boy from 2 houses down. His jacket was thin, zipped up tight, but his small hands trembled in the autumn chill. His cheeks were flushed from the cold, and his eyes held both caution and desperation. "Well now, Eli," Margaret said gently, her voice carrying the calm warmth of decades spent in classrooms. "What brings you out so late, sweetheart?" The boy shifted from foot to foot, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting someone to appear from the shadows. Finally, his voice broke in a whisper. I was wondering if you had something to eat. Please, ma'am." Margaret's heart clenched. She opened the door wide without another word. "Come in, child, come in. You must be freezing." Eli stepped inside quickly, shoulders hunched as though afraid the night might drag him back. The warmth of her home wrapped around him. Lamplight glowed on shelves, lined with books. The smell of cinnamon and pumpkin bread lingered from the afternoon. He stood awkwardly near the door until Margaret guided him toward the kitchen table. "There now," she said, setting a bowl in front of him. "Chicken noodle soup, hot and ready, and a slice of bread to go with it." The boy's eyes widened. He muttered a soft thank you and began eating quickly, almost too quickly, the steam fogging his glasses. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded, watching with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. After a few minutes, when his spoon slowed, she asked carefully, "Eli, darling, why didn't you just eat supper at home?" The question made him freeze. His spoon hovered above the bowl, and for a long moment he didn't breathe. Then, in a trembling voice, he whispered, "Please don't tell Miss Cassie I came here." Margaret's chest tightened. She had seen fear in children's eyes, before fear of tests, fear of failure, fear of strict parents. But this was different. This was deeper, heavier, the kind of fear that made a child sneak into the night for food. "Eli," she said softly, leaning forward, "you're safe here. You can trust me." But he only shook his head and kept eating, his small shoulders drawn tight. Whatever burden he carried, he wasn't ready to share it. When he finished, he stood carefully, thanking her again in a voice so polite it broke her heart. He picked up his worn backpack, ready to disappear back into the dark. Margaret pressed a napkin-wrapped cookie into his hand. "For later," she said with a smile. He gave her a fleeting glance of gratitude, then slipped out the door. She lingered in the doorway, watching his small figure vanish down the street. The porch light buzzed above her. Leaves scuttled along the pavement, and the October wind tugged at his jacket as he disappeared into the shadows. Back in the kitchen, Margaret gathered the dishes. That was when she noticed a small slip of paper under the chair leg. Bending down, she picked it up, curiosity rising. It was a photograph creased at the edges, worn from being carried too long. She unfolded it gently. The picture showed a young woman with warm eyes and a shy smile, her hair caught by the wind. Margaret didn't recognize her, but she could feel the significance in the way Eli had guarded it. She turned it over, no words, no date, just silence, as though the story behind it had been erased. Holding the photo under the kitchen light, Margaret felt her resolve harden. Eli was clinging to this picture like a lifeline. Whoever the woman was, she mattered. And if Eli was sneaking into the night with hunger in his belly and fear in his eyes, then his home was far from safe. Margaret slipped the photo into an envelope and set it on the counter. She whispered to herself, "That boy needs someone to look out for him." And with that quiet promise, she decided she would watch over him. Whatever shadows he faced, she would not let him face them alone. The following afternoon, Nate was driving back from Boston toward Salem. The streets grew quieter as he left the city behind, trading skyscrapers for tree-lined avenues and rows of old colonial houses. October had painted the town in shades of amber and gold. Leaves drifted lazily across the windshield of his SUV, catching in the wipers before sliding away. He slowed as he passed Maple Street, noticing Margaret O'Donnell's familiar white house with its porch swing still creaking in the breeze. Just then, the front door opened, and a boy stepped out. A thin figure with a backpack too large for his frame. He moved quickly, shoulders hunched as though he didn't want to be seen. Something about the sight made Nate ease the car to the curb. He lowered the window. "Need a lift, kid?" His voice was calm, almost casual, though he rarely stopped for anyone. The boy froze, then shook his head. "No, sir." His voice was barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on the sidewalk. Clutching the straps of his backpack, he quickened his pace, eyes darting toward the shadows of the street. On the porch, Margaret appeared with a laundry basket balanced on her hip. She spotted Nate and gave a polite wave. "Evening, Mr. Callahan," she called out. He leaned slightly out the window. "Evening, Margaret. Didn't know you were still here." Her smile was small but warm. "Haven't moved in 30 years. Some roots grow deep, you know." Her gaze followed the boy at the end of the block, then flicked back to Nate. She hesitated, lips pressed together as though she wanted to say something more, but instead she adjusted the basket and disappeared inside. Nate's eyes returned to the boy. Something about him lingered his quick refusal, the fear in his voice. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. He had built a career on reading people, on recognizing what others tried to hide. And this boy, whoever he was, carried a secret that weighed heavily. At the next stop sign, Nate noticed a small object on the sidewalk, half buried in a swirl of leaves. He stepped out, the autumn air sharp against his face, and bent to pick it up. It was a photograph, folded and worn from too many pockets. He unfolded it carefully, the edges frayed between his fingers. The moment he saw the face in the picture, his breath caught. A young woman, smiling shyly at the camera. Her hair lifted slightly in the wind, her eyes warm and unguarded, as though the photographer had caught her off guard. It was a face etched into his memory, no matter how many years had passed. Rebecca. Nate stood there in the quiet street, the sound of children playing in the distance fading from his ears. The world seemed to narrow around him. His chest tightened, and in that instant, memories surged. Harvard Yard, autumn leaves crunching underfoot, her laughter as she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Rebecca, the woman he had once loved, the woman he had left behind for ambition's sake. And now, her face, here, in the hands of a child. The crisp air bit at his skin, but Nate hardly noticed. His thoughts tumbled, colliding with the steady thud of his heartbeat. How could this photograph be here, in Salem, carried by that boy? Nate slipped back into the driver's seat, the photograph trembling slightly between his fingers. He laid it on the passenger seat as though it were fragile glass. His gaze kept drifting to it, to Rebecca's smile frozen in time. He hadn't spoken her name in years, yet it echoed in his chest, as if she had just walked out of the room. The boy's image returned to his mind, the way he clutched his backpack, the fear in his eyes, the quiet, "No, sir." Nate gripped the steering wheel, suddenly aware of the chill in his hands. The boy had carried this picture. It wasn't chance. As he drove slowly down the street, he spotted the boy again in the distance, turning a corner toward the older part of town. Nate hesitated. He wanted to stop, to ask questions, to demand answers from fate itself. But the boy moved too quickly, vanishing among the houses as though he knew how to disappear. Nate continued the short drive home, though home felt like an empty word. When he stepped into his penthouse later that evening, the silence pressed in harder than usual. He set the photo on his desk, the lamp casting a soft glow over Rebecca's face. Memories rose unbidden, her voice encouraging him during exams, her hand in his at late-night walks along the Charles River, the last argument when he had chosen his career over her. He poured a glass of water and sat heavily in the chair. Questions circled him like restless birds. Was the boy connected to her? Did she live nearby? And why did he feel a deep pull in his chest, a pull that felt dangerously close to guilt? Hours passed, but his mind refused to quiet. The city lights blinked outside the window, but all he saw was the small figure of the boy hurrying down the street, clutching a secret he didn't want anyone to know. And the photograph proof that the past he had buried wasn't gone after all. Nate leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his hands covering his face. He felt the familiar ache of regret, sharper now, cutting through the armor he had built over decades. For the first time in years, he whispered her name aloud. Rebecca. Oh. The sound of it filled the empty room. He sat back, eyes fixed on the photo. The question he had been avoiding pressed against him with unbearable weight. Could the boy be hers? And if so, could he be his? The photograph lay on Nate's desk all night, refusing to let him sleep. By morning, he had made a decision. He needed to know the truth. The day was gray, with rain clouds hanging low over Boston. Nate returned from a meeting earlier than usual and walked straight into his study. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, lined with shelves filled mostly with business awards, framed contracts, and plaques commemorating corporate milestones. Yet in the bottom drawer of the cabinet sat a box he hadn't opened in years. He pulled it out, brushing away a thin layer of dust. Inside were college photos, yellowed ticket stubs, a faded Harvard sweatshirt. His hands trembled slightly as he dug through the contents until he found more photographs. Rebecca, laughing under autumn leaves. Rebecca sitting cross-legged in the library. Rebecca leaning on his shoulder at a football game. He sat back heavily, his chest tight. Each picture seemed to whisper, "You walked away. You chose ambition." The memories came rushing back. The promises they had made in whispered conversations. The arguments about his endless internships. And the final fight when he left for a job across the country. She had asked him if success was worth losing her. He had answered by walking away. Now, decades later, her face appeared again through a boy who might be her son. The sound of high heels clicked across the hardwood floor. Cassie appeared in the doorway, dressed impeccably as always, a silk scarf around her neck, her makeup flawless. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching him. "What's this?" she asked lightly, nodding toward the photos spread across his desk. "Old girlfriends?" Nate's jaw tightened. "Just memories." Cassie stepped closer, her smile sharp. "Funny timing. You've been distracted lately. Is something going on?" "Work," he said curtly, sliding the photos into a neat pile. He wasn't about to explain himself. Not to her. She studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shrugged and straightened. "Well, try not to let nostalgia ruin your image. We have a charity dinner Friday. People will expect you to look like you care." Her heels clicked away, leaving the scent of expensive perfume lingering in the air. Nate stared after her, his hands tightening around the photo of Rebecca until the edges bent. When the penthouse door shut behind her, the silence returned, heavier than before. He placed the photo back on the desk, resting his forehead against his hand. The rain began tapping softly against the glass windows, a rhythm that carried him back to another October long ago when he and Rebecca had sat on the steps of Harvard Yard, rain dripping from her umbrella as she laughed at his terrible jokes. He pressed his eyes shut. The boy, Elliot, the way he carried that photograph as if it were a treasure, the way he had glanced at Nate with guarded eyes. The timeline fit too perfectly. Rebecca had disappeared from his life not long after graduation. Elliot looked about 8 years old now. The math lined up, painfully so. Nate sat up slowly, a cold realization threading through him. What if the boy wasn't just Rebecca's? What if he was his? The thought would not leave him. It pressed harder with every hour, until it became less of a question and more of a certainty. The boy was connected to him. Nate rose from the chair and paced the study. The rain outside had strengthened, streaking the tall windows with silver. His reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, tired eyes. A man who had won every battle but the ones that mattered most. He poured himself coffee, but it went cold in his hands as his mind wandered back to Elliot's face. That quiet voice, the way he refused help. Children didn't learn to hide fear like that unless they'd been taught. By late afternoon, Nate found himself driving through Salem again. The streets were slick with rain, and the lamps along Main Street glowed dimly in the mist. He pulled up near Margaret O'Donnell's house. The porch swing moved gently, dripping water from its wooden frame. For a moment, he simply sat in the car, watching, unsure of what he hoped to find. Then the front door opened. Margaret stepped out, umbrella in hand, heading toward her mailbox. She spotted Nate's SUV immediately. With a teacher's instinct, she walked straight to the car and tapped on the window. He rolled it down, rain pattering against the glass roof. "Mr. Callahan," she said kindly but firmly. "Twice in 1 week. You don't usually come this way." Nate hesitated. Words caught in his throat. "That boy who came by your house? Elliot? Do you know him well?" Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained gentle. "I know enough to worry. He's a good boy, polite, hungry more often than he should be." She studied Nate's face, as if reading between the lines. "Why do you ask?" He shifted, fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "Because I think I recognize the woman in the photo he carries. Rebecca Monroe. I knew her once, a long time ago." Margaret tilted her head, the rain dripping from her umbrella. She didn't answer right away, but the silence between them was heavy with understanding. Finally, she said softly, "Then perhaps you already know what you need to do." Nate swallowed hard, throat dry. He wanted to ask 100 questions about Rebecca, about Elliot, about the years that had vanished. But Margaret only patted the car door gently, her eyes kind but resolute. "Children don't choose their beginnings, Mr. Callahan, but you can choose what comes next." She turned and walked back toward her porch, leaving him with the echo of her words. Nate sat in the car, rain thundering on the roof, his heart pounding with the weight of her reminder. He stared down the quiet street, his mind circling the truth he could no longer ignore. He whispered into the silence, his voice raw with disbelief and a touch of hope. "Eli, could he be mine?" The following morning, Nate called in to postpone his meetings, something he rarely did. His assistant sounded surprised, but he didn't offer an explanation. Instead, he drove back to Salem with a sense of urgency pressing against his chest. The streets glistened from the night's rain. A diner on the corner gave off the comforting smell of bacon and coffee, the kind of place where regulars left quarters on the counter for tips and the waitress knew everyone's name. For a moment, Nate wished he could step inside, sit at a booth, and pretend he was just another man living a simple life. But he wasn't here for comfort. He parked near Margaret's house. The porch swing creaked gently in the morning breeze, and the curtains in the front windows stirred. A few minutes later, the door opened and Eli appeared, backpack slung over his shoulders, heading down the steps as if on his way to school. His jacket was still too thin for the cold. "Eli," Nate called softly, stepping out of the car. The boy froze. His eyes widened at the sight of him. For a moment, Nate thought he might bolt, but instead Eli stood still, shoulders tense. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Nate said gently. I wanted to check on you. Can we talk for a minute?" Eli hesitated. His small hands tightened on the straps of his backpack. Finally, he nodded once, cautiously. They walked together toward the sidewalk. Nate crouched a little, trying not to tower over him. "Do you live with Cassie Lowell?" "Yes, sir," Eli whispered. His voice trembled, though he tried to sound steady. Nate studied his face so familiar, in a way he couldn't explain. There was something in the eyes, the tilt of the chin, that pulled at old memories. Does she take care of you?" Eli looked away. He kicked at a leaf on the pavement. She says she does. The words pierced Nate like a blade. Before he could ask more, Margaret appeared on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her. She called out, "Eli, you'll miss the bus. Don't keep standing in the cold." Eli nodded quickly and hurried down the street, leaving Nate standing there with unspoken questions heavy on his tongue. Margaret walked toward him, her expression serious. "I see you've met him properly now." Nate nodded. His throat tightened as he admitted, "He had Rebecca's photo. I found it near your house." Margaret's eyes softened. "He carries it everywhere, like it's a piece of her he can't let go of." Nate swallowed hard. His heart pounded with the weight of realization. Nate felt his throat tighten as Margaret's words sank in. She had chosen them carefully, with the same weight she might use to correct a child in her classroom years ago, gentle but unyielding. "He's been hungry," she added quietly, "more times than I can count, and yet he never complains, never asks for more than a little kindness. That tells me everything I need to know about his home." The air seemed heavier. Nate ran a hand over his jaw, the stubble rasping under his fingers. "And Rebecca?" he asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Margaret hesitated. Her gaze shifted, and for the first time Nate saw something guarded in her eyes. "She passed away a few years ago. Cancer," quietly. "She didn't have much, but she had that boy. He was her whole world." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Rebecca gone, and the boy left behind. Nate's voice dropped. "She never told me." "She had her reasons," Margaret said gently. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is the boy. He needs someone who will stand for him. He needs family." Nate pressed his hand to the hood of the car, the cool metal grounding him as his thoughts spun. He had walked away once, chosen ambition over love. And now, years later, the cost of that choice stood in the shape of a child with Rebecca's eyes, quietly begging for food. Later that day, Nate drove Eli to a small family clinic in Salem, insisting on a checkup under the pretense of routine. Eli had protested at first, wary, but Margaret's gentle nod had persuaded him. Inside the doctor's office, the truth unraveled piece by piece. The doctor noted the boy's weight was below average, his growth stunted. Subtle signs of neglect, nothing that screamed emergency, but enough to paint a picture no child should live through. Nate listened in silence, guilt building with each word. On the way out, Eli clutched a sheet of paper covered in his own sketches. While Nate spoke with the doctor, the boy had quietly drawn with crayons from a box in the waiting room. The pictures were simple: a small house, a closed door, a stick figure alone in a corner. Nate's chest ached as he studied them. "Is this how you feel?" he asked softly. Eli avoided his gaze, but his small voice slipped out. "Sometimes." Nate knelt down, meeting him at eye level. His own reflection shone faintly in the boy's frightened eyes. "You matter, Eli. You matter more than you know." The boy's lips parted as if to say something, but he closed them again, retreating into silence. Still, Nate caught a flicker, something fragile, a spark of hope struggling to survive. That night, back in his penthouse, Nate stood at the window again. But this time, the city lights below didn't dazzle him. They mocked him. For years, he had chased success, believing it would fill the empty spaces in his life. But it had never done what a single child's glance had done today, pierced the armor around his heart. He gripped the photograph of Rebecca in his hand, the edges soft from years of wear. His voice was hoarse, but the words were steady. "I should have been there. I won't fail him again." The headlines broke before Nate was ready. A glossy magazine out of New York ran Cassie's picture across its society pages. Charity queen and devoted stepmother balances marriage with philanthropy. The photo showed her in a shimmering gown, smiling as if the world adored her. The article painted her as the very image of sacrifice, raising her husband's troubled stepson while still managing to host galas and fundraisers. Nate clenched the newspaper until the ink smudged his fingers. Troubled stepson? The lie burned hotter than any corporate betrayal he had ever faced. The following week, Boston Family Court became the stage for the truth. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, their breath clouding in the November air. Nate kept his head high, but inside his chest, his heart pounded. Beside him, Samuel Reyes, his lawyer, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Remember, Nate," Samuel said softly, "it isn't about winning. It's about Eli. Speak from the heart." Inside, the courtroom carried the solemn hush of polished wood and the faint echo of voices. Judge Judith Harris presided, her glasses perched low as she scanned the papers before her. A woman with decades of experience, she had the air of someone who had seen every excuse, every lie, and every desperate plea. Cassie sat on the opposite bench, dressed in a dark suit, pearls gleaming at her throat. Her expression was composed, almost saintly. When she spoke, her voice was smooth as silk. "Your Honor, I have done everything to provide for Elliot Monroe. I've given him shelter, education, stability. If he has wandered or begged food from neighbors, it is because he struggles emotionally. I've never denied him care." Ambo, her lawyer, nodded along, presenting carefully curated photographs. Cassie reading to Eli on a couch, Cassie standing beside him at a community event. Nate knew the truth behind those smiles-posed moments for the camera, while the boy withered in silence. When it was Nate's turn, he stood slowly, his voice steady but raw. "Your Honor, I will not pretend I was the father Eli deserved from the beginning. I didn't even know he was mine until recently. I failed Rebecca, and I failed him. But now I know, and I will not walk away again. He deserves better than fear and neglect. He deserves family." The courtroom murmured softly, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Judge Harris's eyes flickered, not softened, but sharpened as though measuring his sincerity. Eli sat quietly near the front, small hands twisting in his lap. Margaret leaned close to him, whispering encouragement. The boy's shoulders trembled. Nate caught his gaze and nodded gently, as if to say, "It's safe now. You can speak." For a long moment, Eli stayed silent. Then slowly he rose to his feet. His voice was barely above a whisper at first, but in the stillness of the courtroom, it carried. Eli's small voice trembled, but it filled the room. "Sometimes I don't have dinner. Sometimes I have to ask Miss Margaret for food." He glanced at Cassie, his hands tightening around the edge of his sweater. "She tells me not to talk about it. She says no one will believe me." A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Judge Harris raised her hand for silence, her expression unreadable, but her eyes lingered on the boy with a weight of compassion. Nate's chest ached as he listened. Every word was another crack in the polished image Cassie had tried to present. He wanted to cross the room, to shield Eli from the stares, but he forced himself to remain steady. This was Eli's truth to tell. Cassie shifted in her chair, her mask slipping. "That's a lie," she snapped before her lawyer could stop her. "The boy is confused. He's always been dramatic." "Enough," Judge Harris cut in, her voice sharp. The gavel struck once, echoing against the paneled walls. "This is a child, not a witness to be ridiculed." The silence that followed was heavy. Samuel leaned toward Nate and whispered, "We have something else. The test results came in this morning." He slid a sealed envelope across the table. Nate's hands shook as he opened it. Inside was the DNA report, proof that Elliot Monroe was not just Rebecca's son, but his own. Samuel rose and handed the document to the judge. "Your Honor, this establishes beyond question that Mr. Callahan is the biological father." Judge Harris adjusted her glasses, scanning the report. The room seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she looked up, her gaze steady. "The court acknowledges the result. Mr. Callahan, you are this boy's father." The words hit Nate like a wave, both crushing and liberating. His knees nearly gave way, but he steadied himself with the table. After years of silence, after choices he regretted, the truth had been spoken. Across the courtroom, Cassie's face drained of color. For the first time, her composure cracked. She reached for her lawyer, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. Eli looked toward Nate, his eyes wide, searching. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to blur, leaving only the boy and the man bound together by truth. Nate managed a small nod, his throat too tight for words. The boy's lips trembled, then curved into the faintest, tentative smile. The gavel struck again, calling the room back to order. Judge Harris's voice was firm. "We will reconvene tomorrow to determine guardianship and next steps. For now, court is adjourned." Chairs scraped, voices rose. But Nate heard none of it. He kept his eyes on Eli, who clung to Margaret's hand yet did not look away from him. As they left the courtroom, Nate whispered to himself, a vow as steady as his heartbeat. I'll never leave you again. The courthouse had emptied, leaving only the echo of footsteps in its marble halls. Outside, the November sky was pale and overcast, the kind of sky that seemed to press down on the town, holding in the chill of the coming winter. Nate lingered on the steps, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, watching as Eli walked slowly beside Margaret toward the square. For years, Nate had walked out of courtrooms with contracts signed, deals sealed, reputations secured, but never had his heart felt so unsteady, so fragile, as it did in that moment when a boy glanced back at him with cautious eyes. Eli, Nate called softly, his voice carrying across the steps like a prayer. The boy stopped. His shoulders stiffened, as if preparing for something painful. Margaret touched his arm, her own gaze moving toward Nate. Go on, sweetheart, she whispered gently. You can hear him out. Eli turned, slowly, hesitantly. His eyes were guarded, as though trust had been broken too many times before. Nate walked toward him, each step measured. When he finally crouched to meet the boy's gaze, his voice was quiet, stripped of the authority that once commanded boardrooms. I don't want you to be afraid of me, Nate said. I know I wasn't there when I should have been, but I want to be here now, if you'll let me. For a long moment, the boy said nothing. He shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder, his lips pressed tightly together, as if weighing whether words were worth the risk. Margaret intervened with a gentle firmness. It's cold, and none of us should be standing here with empty stomachs. Let's go to the diner. It's easier to talk when there's warmth and food. The old Main Street diner was alive, with its usual mid-morning rhythm. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, releasing a wave of warmth, coffee, and bacon grease into the air. The jukebox in the corner played a faded Sinatra tune, and the chatter of locals filled the room like an old song everyone knew. Margaret slid into her usual booth, nodding to the waitress who greeted her by name. Eli slipped in across from Nate, his small hands folded tightly on the table as if bracing for a storm. The waitress poured Nate a mug of coffee and set a steaming cup of hot chocolate in front of Eli. On the house, darling, she said with a smile. The boy blinked in surprise, cupping the warm mug as though it were too good to be real. His gaze flickered to Nate's, just for an instant, and in that glance was a question Nate hoped to answer, not with promises, but with patience. Nate leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. I saw your drawings at the clinic. You're good, Eli. Really good. The boy's fingers tightened around the mug. It's easier to draw than to talk, he murmured. Nate nodded slowly. I understand that. Sometimes I used to write numbers and plans because it was easier than saying what I felt. Maybe you could show me your drawings sometime. Only if you want to. There was no reply, but the boy's grip eased. His lips twitched, not quite a smile, but not resistance either. Margaret caught the small shift and smiled softly, her eyes saying what her lips did not. This is how trust begins. The waitress soon returned with their meals. A plate of golden pancakes dusted with powdered sugar for Eli, crisp bacon and eggs for Nate, and a warm bowl of oatmeal for Margaret. The food steamed in the soft light from the diner's hanging lamps, turning the booth into a small island of comfort against the gray November morning. Eli hesitated at first, fork poised as though waiting for permission. Nate noticed and slid the syrup closer with a gentle smile. Go on, he said quietly. This is yours. You don't have to wait. The boy poured the syrup slowly, almost ceremoniously, then took a cautious bite. By the second, his pace quickened, and by the third, he was eating with the hunger of someone too often denied the basics of childhood. Nate's chest ached at the sight, equal parts guilt and relief, sorrow and gratitude. Margaret sipped her coffee, watching them with the patience of a teacher who had seen countless children wrestle with invisible battles. Food always tastes better when you feel safe, she said softly. Eli looked up, his cheeks flushed, and for the first time, a small laugh slipped out light and unguarded. It startled him, as though he hadn't expected it, but Nate caught it and held on to the sound like a fragile gift. When the plates were cleared and the mugs refilled, conversation began to flow in halting starts. Nate asked about school, about Eli's favorite subjects. The boy admitted he liked history because stories already happened, so you know how they end. Nate smiled faintly. Sometimes, knowing how something ends helps us understand how to begin again. Eli tilted his head at that, puzzling over the words, but didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He hesitated before sliding it across the table. It was a sketch, a house with a tall porch, a figure standing in the doorway, and a child sitting on the steps. The lines were rough, but the emotion was clear. Longing, waiting, hoping. Nate's throat tightened as he studied it. He wanted to ask if the man on the porch was meant to be him, but he didn't. Some truths were too delicate to force into words. When they stepped back outside, the air was sharp and clean after the morning rain. Puddles glittered on the pavement, reflecting the pale sky. They walked together toward the bus stop, Margaret's shawl flapping in the wind. Children were already gathering, their backpacks bouncing, their voices carrying in the crisp air. Eli shifted nervously, clutching his backpack to his chest. Nate crouched beside him again, lowering his voice so only the boy could hear. "I'll be here when you get back," he said. "That's a promise." The bus screeched to a halt, its doors swinging open. Eli hesitated on the step, glancing back just once. His eyes met Nate's, still cautious, still questioning, but carrying a spark of something new. Hope. The bus pulled away, leaving a trail of exhaust in the cold air. Nate stood there, watching until it turned the corner and disappeared. Beside him, Margaret rested a hand lightly on his arm. "Trust takes time," she said gently. "But you've given him a reason to believe again." Nate nodded, the words settling deep in his chest. For the first time in years, the weight of his success and failures didn't matter. What mattered was the boy on that bus and the fragile promise that bound them together. As the last echo of the engine faded, Nate whispered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else, "This time, I'll stay." The decision came on a cold December morning, when snow powdered the brick sidewalks of Salem and wreaths hung from the lampposts along Main Street. Inside the family courthouse, the atmosphere was hushed, the air carrying the smell of polished wood and winter coats drying near the radiator. Judge Harris adjusted her glasses, her tone steady yet softened by experience. "Given the testimony, the evidence of neglect, and the DNA results confirming paternity, guardianship of Elliot Monroe will be granted to his biological father, Nathaniel Callahan." The gavel struck once, sharp as a church bell. The sound echoed in Nate's chest, reverberating through years of regret and longing. For a breathless moment, he simply sat frozen, as though time had folded around him. Eli, seated with Margaret in the front row, looked up quickly, his eyes wide and uncertain. His small hands twisted the edge of his sweater, and he searched Nate's face for meaning. Nate rose slowly, his legs unsteady, and walked toward him. He crouched down so their eyes were level, his voice gentle, trembling with emotion. "You don't have to go back there anymore. You're coming home with me." Eli blinked rapidly, his lip trembling. For an instant, he looked as if he might not believe it. And then, as though something inside him finally loosened, he threw his arms around Nate's neck. The hug was fierce and desperate, carrying years of silence and hunger. Nate closed his eyes and wrapped his arms around the boy, his throat too tight for words. Margaret dabbed her eyes with a folded handkerchief, her smile tender and knowing. She had seen children grow, falter, and rise again. But this was a homecoming. Later that evening, Nate didn't take Eli back to Boston's glass and steel penthouse. Instead, he drove them both through the snowy streets of Salem to a small colonial house with a front porch swing and white shutters. He had purchased it quietly, a decision made weeks earlier when he began to believe that life might offer second chances. The house smelled faintly of pine and cinnamon, thanks to Margaret, who had helped prepare it. In the living room, a Christmas tree stood by the window, its branches strung with clumsy but cheerful lights. Ornaments gleamed in the glow, and a single star rested crookedly at the top. Eli stopped just inside the doorway, his eyes wide. "You did this?" he whispered. Nate rubbed the back of his neck. "I tried. I'm not very good at decorating, but I thought maybe you could help me fix it." The boy's smile came quickly, without hesitation. "I can do that." "Oh." Together they unpacked the remaining ornaments. Eli laughed when the garland wrapped around Nate's shoulders like a scarf, and Nate laughed too, a sound that felt both new and familiar. They adjusted the star, strung the light straighter, and stepped back to admire their work. In the quiet glow of the tree, Nate rested his hand gently on Eli's shoulder. "It's not just a tree," he said softly. "It's the start of us, our beginning." Eli leaned against him, his small weight steady and warm. Outside, snow fell gently across the rooftops of Salem, covering the town in a hush of peace. Inside the house, two lives once scattered by loss and regret began to weave together into something whole again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither Nate nor Eli had known before. Morning meant cereal bowls on the kitchen table, Nate fumbling with the coffee pot while Eli sketched quietly in a notebook. Afternoons brought the sound of the school bus groaning to a stop at the corner, Nate waiting by the window with a scarf in hand, ready to walk his son home. Evenings were filled with the soft rituals of family life, checking homework, sharing stories at supper, listening to the radio hum while snow fell softly outside. For Nate, it was a learning curve. He burned toast, folded laundry wrong, and once forgot to put gloves in Eli's backpack on a freezing day. Yet Eli never complained. Each mistake became a chance for laughter, a chance for Eli to realize that someone was trying, not perfectly, but faithfully. That was enough. One night, while Margaret sat knitting in the armchair, Eli pulled something from his backpack, a small box he had guarded carefully. Inside was the faded photograph of Rebecca, the one he had carried for years. He placed it gently on the table between them, his fingers trembling. "I still miss her," he whispered, eyes downcast. The room grew still. Nate reached out, his hand covering the boy's. His voice was low, but steady. "So do I, son. Every day. But she left us a gift. She left us each other." The boy's eyes shimmered, and this time when Nate said son, Eli didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned forward, wrapping his arms tightly around him. The embrace was wordless, but it carried all the meaning in the world: trust, healing, and the first true sense of home. That Christmas Eve, the little house came alive with warmth. The tree glowed in the living room, stockings hung by the fireplace, and neighbors dropped by with pies and greetings. Laughter filled the air, rising to the rafters, carrying with it the sound of belonging. Margaret hummed softly as she finished her knitting, watching the scene with a smile that held both relief and joy. Later, as the night grew quiet and the snow deepened outside, Nate lifted a glass of cider. His voice was gentle, but it carried enough to reach every corner of the room. "I used to think success meant winning in boardrooms, climbing higher, owning more. But I was wrong. Success is this family, forgiveness, a chance to start again, even when you think it's too late." Eli leaned against him, drowsy, his small smile reflecting the glow of the star atop the tree. Outside, the world was hushed in white. Inside, for the first time in decades, Nate's heart was at peace. He had found redemption not in wealth or power, but in the steady heartbeat of the boy who finally called him father. And so the story closed, not with an ending, but with a beginning, the kind that promised hope, forgiveness, and the unshakable strength of family. There is a certain stillness at the end of a winter's day that carries more meaning than words can hold. The kind of stillness you find when the snow has just settled on the rooftops, when the tree in the window glows softly against the night, and when two hearts long separated by loss and regret finally beat together under the same roof. That is where we leave Nate and Eli. Not in the grand chambers of a courthouse, not in the glossy pages of a magazine, but in the humble warmth of a home lit by love. And friends, if you felt that warmth in your own heart tonight, press the number 1. If you felt the story left something wanting, or if you carry thoughts to share, type 0. Either way, you are part of this circle, and your voice matters here. For all of us who have traveled far down the road of life, this story is not just about a man reclaiming his son. It is about something deeper, something we all recognize in our bones. It is about the power of returning, of turning back when the easy choice is to keep walking away. It is about how love, even delayed, even clumsy, can still heal wounds. Nate's greatest achievement was not carved into a skyline or inked on a contract. His true success came when he bent down to meet a boy's eyes and whispered, "I'll stay." That moment, more than any fortune or title, was the measure of a life redeemed. The lesson is simple, yet eternal. Unconditional kindness can change the course of another's life. Every soul, no matter how small, no matter how overlooked, deserves a place at the table. And happiness, true happiness, does not arrive when we hoard life for ourselves, but when we share it freely with others. Think of it as a Sunday supper in a family kitchen. The pot roast may be overcooked, the rolls a little burnt, but the laughter around the table is what fills us. That is the treasure, not the perfection of the meal, but the presence of love. Like a lantern glowing quietly in a farmhouse window, one simple act of compassion can guide us home through the darkest night. We see it in neighbors who shovel a sidewalk for someone too frail to do it themselves, in grandparents who keep an extra chair at the table just in case, in the way a smile from a stranger lingers long after the day is ended. These gestures may seem small, but for the one who receives them, they are everything. They are proof that the world has not forgotten them, that family is larger than blood, and that love, when given freely, becomes its own kind of inheritance. For those of us blessed with long years, it is never too late to turn back toward the things that matter. Perhaps you remember evenings on the porch swing, when neighbors waved across the street and children played until the streetlights blinked on. Perhaps you remember a family holiday when an empty chair brought tears, or when a word of forgiveness mended a rift you thought could never heal. Stories like this remind us that redemption is not locked away in the past. It is here, now, waiting whenever we choose to reach for it. Just as snow softens the rough ground of winter, forgiveness lays a path for second chances, no matter our age. So as we close the pages of this tale, let it be not an ending but an invitation. Tonight, after the dishes are cleared and the television hum quiets, pause for a moment. Think of someone who needs to hear from you, someone who deserves to know they are not forgotten, that they still belong. Maybe it's a child who has drifted away. Maybe a friend you haven't called in years. Maybe even yourself. Send that word of kindness. Offer that forgiveness. Light that lantern. And if this story touched your heart, consider sharing it not for numbers, not for applause, but to keep alive the belief that family, forgiveness, and love are treasures worth passing on. For in the end, it is not the wealth we leave behind that endures, but the love we hand forward like a steady flame against the night, guiding those we care for safely home.